Hello, I'm Jonathan Friedmann, Admissions Director and Associate Professor at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. IISHJ offers professional training programs, adult learning opportunities, resources, and publications, the latest of which we're excited to talk about today. I'm delighted to chat with Rabbis Adam Shalom and Jody Kornfeld, the co-editors of a new anthology, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, Beliefs, Values, Practices, published by the Jewish Publication Society and the University of Nebraska Press. The title of your book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, positions the collected essays in the present as opposed to the past or what may lie ahead in the future. The essays originate from the late 20th century and the 21st century. How has humanistic Judaism evolved since its founding over 50 years ago?
Well, I'll take this one. Jonathan, thank you for having us. The movement started in the suburban Detroit area in the 1960s. It was led by a reform-trained rabbi named Sherwin Wine and a small group of families. Wine himself had grown up in the densely ethnic Jewish neighborhoods of Detroit, so he had deep roots in the community. He'd gone to University of Michigan and studied philosophy, becoming all but dissertation in advanced study of that, and also had been ordained by Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, including serving as a chaplain in the U.S. Army stationed in Korea. And through all of those experiences, he had realized that Jewish behavior and official Jewish beliefs often were very different. He tells the story that when he was in Korea, running services was a lot less important than getting kosher salami for the soldiers who were stationed there. It was the food, it was the nostalgia, it was the family connection, it was the community with other Jews more so than the religious ideology or the ritual practices for most of the Jews who were stationed there at the time. And so when this movement started, when the first congregation started in 1963, they began by asking questions. They didn't want to know necessarily what Jews should believe or what the tradition told them to believe, but they wanted to discover, what do I actually believe? How do I live my life? And they realized that when they got sick, they didn't pray for healing. They went to a doctor and tried to find out what was actually happening and what had humanity discovered to try and help them feel better. If they wanted to learn about the history of the Jewish people, they didn't only look at the traditional sources like the Bible or the Talmud. They also looked at what archaeology and critical science had to say about that, just as they would for the history of any other people in any other place in the world. When they were trying to decide how to be a good person, they realized that they were deciding right and wrong much more based on the consequences of their behavior, the effects of what they did, rather than what the tradition commanded them to do. Just obeying the commandments didn't necessarily guarantee ethical choices. And most importantly, they found that their focus in life was much more here and now, and the human experience within themselves or in relation to other people in the natural world, much more so than above and beyond in some kind of supernatural realm or supernatural being or beings. Now, there had been previous examples of secular Judaisms in the early 20th century. Think about the Jewish socialist world, often focused in Yiddish, or the labor Zionist world, focused in Hebrew, the kibbutz movement in Israel, and pre-Israel settlement. These were all ways to try to connect to Jewish culture and Jewish identity that were not focused on religious practice and belief. But there were two major differences in humanistic Judaism. The first was that it maintained the religious framework. It had a rabbi. They called themselves a congregation. They were willing to celebrate what had been conventionally understood as religious Jewish holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which the kibbutz movement and the Jewish socialist movement often didn't do anything for. They figured if you want Yom Kippur, go to a synagogue. We do Jewish culture. We can recreate Passover as a workers' rebellion. That works great. But some of the other holidays, maybe we'll just let go or leave it in the religious department. Same thing with life cycle events like the bar mitzvah. It was a religious event. Why bother trying to save it? Where in humanistic Judaism, even though they had a secular approach to life, they felt this is part of the cultural Jewish inheritance they want to continue. And they felt that their humanism was on the spectrum of religious options. And therefore, it was legitimate for them to reclaim those elements. And that was the other side of what made them distinct. Instead of focusing on a kind of neutral secularism of, well, we don't do that religious stuff, they had a positive ideology of humanism, an emphasis on human power, responsibility, and knowledge that they could then use to filter and recreate how they celebrated Jewish culture. And in terms of the movement's development, By 1969, there were enough people who'd heard about this approach that they were interested in creating other communities. The Society for Humanistic Judaism started in 1969 with congregations in Michigan, which was the founding congregation, as well as suburban Chicago and Fairfield, Connecticut. In 1985, the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism was founded, which we were coming up on 40 years of that organization. And in 1995, they created an anthology called Judaism in a Secular Age, which is still in print. It included the historical elements of pre-20th century, as well as a section called Framers of Secular Judaism, which included leaders in our movement from the United States and Canada, from Israel and from Europe, including Rabbi Wein and others. Um, when we sat down to think about what to do with this book 30 years later, we realized that a lot of those leaders either weren't involved anymore or, to be honest, weren't around anymore. And our ideas as a movement had shifted in 30 years. So we wanted to find ways to draw on the best of the old ideas alongside some of the new ideas and new voices that have been talking to our movement. So you had asked initially, before I started this long answer, about how the movement evolved. I would say that some of us are more open to connections with Jewish tradition than that initial rebel generation. When I was growing up, I grew up at the Birmingham Temple, which was Sherwin Wein's congregation, and he would sometimes talk about the rabbis think this, but we think that. And I, at some point, said to myself, "Aren't you a rabbi? Which are you? Are we part of the rabbinic tradition, or are we opposed to the rabbinic tradition? Well, maybe there are times we're one and times we're another." Um, We've had an ongoing conversation in our movement about spirituality and humanistic Judaism. Are we spiritual people or not? Well, we don't talk to the spirit world, but we certainly want to be inspired. So, how do we balance those things out? We have to apply our values to new conditions, new circumstances, and new issues. And so, the idea behind this collection is that it's the best of our founding ideas and the best of our recent ideas. We learn a lesson from Jewish history in this. When the Bible canon was closed and the rabbis decided this is all the books that count as scripture, that didn't stop Jewish ideas and Jewish creativity. In fact, it sparked Jewish ideas and creativity with the birth of midrash and commentary, the evolution of rabbinic law. A living tradition grows and changes. It does not only repeat the mantras and recite the texts of the past, and that's really the motivation behind creating this new anthology.
Whenever I speak about humanistic Judaism to curious people, more often than not, they'll say, well, isn't Judaism humanistic anyway? Because there are layers of humanism sort of behind or underneath or aside the more supernatural claims and so forth. So what makes humanistic Judaism distinct from just the humanism that we might find within Judaism generally?
So I think that sometimes it's phrased are we Jewish humanists or humanists who happen to be Jewish? And I think the very fact that the movement is called Humanistic Judaism, humanistic becomes the modifier. And we are always thrilled and excited when we find one or more of our values reflected back, love your neighbor as yourself and things like that. But it doesn't mean that we have to accept everything that the tradition had for us. Because there's a lot of things that we would not find acceptable today. The tradition and, thanking a God that you're not born a woman. Those are, that's something that would feel very difficult to say, we embrace the entire tradition. And so I think that it's to say, are we humanistic Jews or Jewish humanists? There's a difference between the two. And we center Judaism, but we also have a synthesis with humanism. So we take a positive approach to our celebrations, to our life cycle events, and so on. And we use our tradition and to sort of activate our different ethics and beliefs. We're obviously confined to the natural world. We don't invoke the spirit world or anything like that. But as Adam sort of alluded to, there's a human need for connection, for understanding that there are some things that are more transcendent. I think that anybody who witnesses the birth of their child understands that, that gets you beyond just yourself. So I think that those things are really important to understand. Also, the Judaism is really an important piece because that's our collective family. Now, of course, we're part of the human family. And I know when I do a baby welcoming or naming ceremony, I welcome that child into the particular family, into the Jewish family, and into the human family. So it's all those layers or concentric circles of family. But for Jews, this is our ancestral family. And I think that we want to sort of keep that front and center. And when there are things that do, in fact, coincide and make the synthesis an easier one, obviously, we want to hang on to that. But we very much feel the freedom to be able to reinterpret, recenter, reorient, and take a look at historically what was going on. You know, if we take a look at Hanukkah, we're not observing it because of miracles and oil, but we view it centrally, thematically, as a fight for religious freedom.
Even if the Maccabees went off the deep end
Yes.
on that topic with regard to other people. But that's part of our approach, is being able to handle complexity. You know, we can talk about the Maccabees as fighting for their religious freedom and then imposing their religious ideology on other people, including Hellenistic Jews, who we might have had more sympathy with than even some of the Maccabees. We also can live with the complexity of multiple identities. You know, that wonderful line from the non-Jewish poet, we contain multitudes. I contain multitudes. That's all of us. We are our gender, our culture, our language, our political allegiance, our sports teams. You know, we have all these identities that are part of who we are. And so we can be humanistic and Jewish. And so I actually find the sort of semantics of the argument less interesting than what do you do with it? You know, whether you prefer Jewish humanist or humanistic Jew, how do you celebrate the holiday? Where do you find meaning in life? What's most inspiring to you from the Jewish experience? That's really the creative part of things. And labeling is a function of language, and whether we want to be precise or not, I think phenomenologically, we're doing similar things. It's one of the reasons why our movement actually has made common cause with secular Jewish organizations and other cultural Jewish organizations, because whatever we call it, we're doing very similar things with a similar approach to life. And let's work together to get the word out that you don't have to just put up with a not satisfying Jewish experience. If you really, in your heart, are a humanistic Jew, you don't have to conform to the conventional approaches. You don't have to recite the words that don't reflect what you believe. There's a better option out there, and you can help create it with us. And that's really the exciting part of both our movement and I think also this book.
Yeah,
Did
and I
you
was going
notice
to
any recurring themes as you were putting together the book?
Yeah, I think so. I think that we sort of observed we're kind of in that liminal space, right, between humanism and Judaism. And so how are we going to synthesize those things? And we were very aware of recurring tensions and challenges that we might have had. If you have multiple identities, are they co-equal, or at different times, does one take precedence? Does another take precedence? We have the tension between universalism and particularism, so that, you know, we don't view ourselves as the chosen people. We're not particular in that way, but our experiences and our history shows that Jewish history, yes, it's part of human history, but it has its own unique telling. And so those were some of the challenges, and we tried to point them out, you know, that we don't want pluralism to swallow up Judaism. We want to find an appropriate balance or the equilibrium between them. We want to sort of say, yes, you can be Jewish without compromise. You know, you don't have to just settle for a different movement that's going to have you recite words that you don't believe or that you don't even know the meaning of. Instead, you can do this with integrity, but then there's that challenge of how much from the past, how much continuity, and then and tradition, and how much do we break with that? And how much can we borrow, if you will, from the wider outside culture, which we do in terms of music and poetry and things like that, but also make sure that it's consistent with either the humanistic part or the Jewish part. so that we're not overcompensating, if you will, that we're not taking too much from outside and then our Jewish message gets completely diluted. So I think we were very aware of that tension. And I think probably if we did a word search in the manuscript, we would see the word tension or challenge a lot. Because we really were very conscious of the idea that, yes, we as congregational rabbis, we know these things, we've been taught, we practice it, etc. But not everybody who comes to humanistic Judaism either is aware of it or is able to articulate it.
We also hope that people who aren't humanistic Jews might read the book and learn something about who we are. Just as we had to learn about orthodoxy in our rabbinic training, maybe they should learn a little bit about us too. One other theme I wanted to highlight that came up, and I was surprised in how many places it showed up, is the balance of the group and the individual. We emphasize both the freedom of the individual to make choices about their own life, their own identity, but also the balancing of that with being part of a community and feeling connected to a group and a tradition and a heritage. So we could have, in our movement, created everything brand new from scratch, and then it would have fully agreed with our ideology and had our authorship on it and felt like we were self-empowered. But then we lose the value of tradition and heritage and culture and commonality with other Jewish communities. But if we only did the traditional liturgy practice and so on, then we wouldn't have a way to express our movement. And also, what about the individual? What's meaningful to them? Maybe you like poetry, but you're not a fan of prose, or you like prose and you don't really get poetry. There shouldn't only be one method, one mode to express a humanistic Jewish identity. And this also applied to being part of a humanistic Jewish identity in the first place. The choice of who your marriage partner is, becoming Jewish, which we'll talk about in a bit. That's also a function of the individual choosing to identify with the Jewish people, not simply a country club with an admission standard that you have to meet before the group will allow you to be in. So this individual versus community I found to be a very interesting theme running through ethics, identity, practices, all kinds of areas.
Yeah, there's an interesting term for this in the sociology of religion, which is isomorphism, the same shape, right? So the idea that if you are going to create a group that maybe is less conventional than other groups, you still have to have the different elements, the different touchstones that make it feel like a Jewish community or feel like a Jewish experience, even as you're more flexible with certain language choices, music choices, etc.
And that makes sense. I was going to also add that yes, the individual autonomy and being part of a community, but being part of a community also adds that layer of what's your responsibility to the group. And so when you get a lot of people, and it's almost like herding cats to a certain extent, that you get a lot of people who are used to, if they're attracted to the philosophy, they want to do things in a very different way, and they focus on the individual and the empowerment that they feel that they have over their own lives. But there's still a responsibility to the group to be able to be a part of a community and then understand what exactly does that mean? What are my obligations to others?
The book is divided into 4 parts: beliefs and ethics, identity, culture, and Jewish life. Could you briefly describe how these 4 elements, which are central to Judaism in general, are distinct from a Jewish humanistic point of view?
So I thought it might be helpful to maybe break it out into the specific pieces, and Jody and I will go back and forth in talking about them, and then have a chance to respond to the other person as well. On the belief front, we've already touched on some of these topics on the emphasis on the natural world, the human experience, human autonomy, and so on. But we decided to start the book with a wonderful essay by Sherwin Wine on the lessons we learned from Jewish history. Because in many ways, we are humanists not simply from abstract philosophical explorations, but from our reading of our people's experience. And our people's experience for us shares a message that we have to rely on ourselves and on other people, that we have to be the authors of our fate and not trust to the kindness of the fates, or capital F, the fate, who is deciding everything for us. It's a lesson in humanism and in human self-reliance and ethics. It really is why we're humanistic Jews. It's our reading of Jewish history, just as A more traditional religious reading of Jewish history has different lessons about obedience and so on. So we take Jewish history as our starting point for who we are, even philosophically. We also have a chapter that's really important on positive humanism because it's about what we do and not what we don't do. It's about what we do believe and not what we don't believe. We always tried, and our editor was really wonderful in pushing us to also focus in this direction and not defining ourselves in opposition to other movements or other practices. You get a lot of lay humanistic Jews who will say, well, I'm not reform, I don't keep kosher. They're listing all the things they don't do, when actually they're the majority of Jews who prefer freedom of choice when it comes to what they eat. They prefer to experience the variety of human cultures and cuisines. They want to eat at their neighbor's house, even if their neighbor happens to not be Jew. There's all kinds of positive values that might inspire you to go beyond those traditional kosher limitations. And so why not find ways to express our beliefs more positively and to say what we do believe? There's a wonderful essay by Sherwin Wine on this called Believing is Better Than Non-Believing. It's just a stronger, more self-affirming, inspirational stance. And then we do have a section talking about what comes up all the time, the God question. Do you believe in God or not? People love to ask that one. And we certainly accept God as a literary character, right? You can't read the Hebrew Bible or Jewish literature and thought without understanding God as a human creation. But we also understand that this belief is something that doesn't fit with our understanding of how the world works, how history has worked, and where we find the strength we need to deal with the problems that we face in life. And we've also decided to change a Jewish tradition in this respect. There's a long and rich Jewish tradition of saying the old words and claiming they mean something else, whether it's redefining the God and gods of the Hebrew Bible to be purely monotheistic in rabbinic thought, or to take the sometimes anarchic theology of the Talmud and making it purely systematic in Maimonides' reinterpretation. In modern times, we've had many movements who've tried to redefine God as love or the force for good in the universe, whether you're talking Reform or Reconstructionists or even some brands of conservative Judaism. You've got partnership theology where God wants the best for you but can't really intervene in the world. And then you read your liturgy and it's all about God intervening in the world, and you read the Hebrew Bible and it's all about God intervening in the world. So what are we doing here? And one of the things that Sherwin Wine did very courageously at the founding of the movement was to say, if I want to talk about love, I'm going to say love. If I want to talk about inspiration or power for good in the world, I'm going to say power for good in the world. I don't have to call it God for it to be meaningful. And in fact, that enables me to talk about God as the character or God as the concept with more clarity. The more fuzzy you get, the messier it is. And it's more inspirational for us to be able to say what we mean. So that's why we tackle the God question, but are not willing to simply try to keep the word at the expense of clarity and inspiration. After all, for many people, it carries the baggage of those old ideas. You can't just willy-nilly refine words to mean what you want them to mean, as it's described in, I think, in Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, one of those books. A character says, words mean what I want them to mean. Well, I'm sorry, that isn't how life works. And so we prefer to find more inspirational language that speaks to who we are and what we value, as we'll talk about a bit in the liturgy side as well. Instead of singing Oseh Shalom, he will make peace, we sing Na'aseh Shalom, we will make peace. I'll call Ha'olam for all the world, not just I'll call Yisrael. It's only in the last maybe 15 or 20 years I've begun to see other movements start to even be willing to change the Hebrew, where they'll say, I'll call Yoshvei Tevel, for all the people who dwell on the earth, and not just for all Israel. But they've been willing to change the translations before because what they meant is not what it said. Our approach is we want to say what we mean what we say, and be clear on what we believe. And what we share as a belief is that positive emphasis on human action, human power, and human responsibility. So I don't know, Jody, if you have any other things to add on the beliefs front.
A couple of quick things on that. So when Jews define themselves by what they don't do, they often reach a conclusion about themselves that they are a, quote, bad Jew. Or we will hear all the time, I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious. And, when it's a cold call or somebody wants to know about the congregation and so on, and they tell you that, my first response is, you're not a bad Jew. If you're living an unethical life, you might be a bad person, but by not keeping kosher or doing any of those things does not make you a bad Jew. And then the other thing is, Rabbi Wein, I believe, described being a humanistic Jew, it required living a life of courage. And to be able to say some of these things out loud when you are not just simply in your community or with our colleagues or whatever, that takes a level of self-assurance that what you believe is worthy and worthy of articulation. So I was recently in a workshop, and there must have been, I don't know, 30 people or so. And the opening question was that to define a sacred text. And everybody went around and had a different, adjective or whatever they were going to use. Then the next one was to use a word or phrase when you hear the word God. And I was thinking, uh-oh. I'm not sure I'm in the right workshop, but I stayed, and everybody's going around with infinite and comforting and, unknowable, et cetera, et cetera. And we got to my turn and I said, human created literary character. And some people in the room who knew that I was a humanistic rabbi made total sense. Some other people had a little bit of a, uh-oh, what'd she say? kind of moment. But being able to articulate, as Adam was saying, to say what we mean what we say in any language. It's not okay to just recite Hebrew if you don't understand the Hebrew, but when you find out what the translation is, to say, I don't believe that for a minute. That's not the integrity piece that is really central and important to humanistic Judaism.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the God talk in general is that all talk about God is metaphorical anyway. So you're just sort of expanding the meaning of this term that doesn't really mean anything after a while. So why not just throw it out and speak directly, as Sharon Wine taught us all to do?
And sometimes the metaphor just doesn't work anymore. For some people, it works to have that flexible, fuzzy meaning. I have colleagues and friends who are happy saying God that means 17 different things, but doesn't work for everybody. And so it's an aesthetic choice as much as a philosophical or ideological choice.
Yeah. So I think although it was coupled together in the book as belief and ethics, if we separate that out and we talk a little bit about ethics, it follows that idea of positive humanism and human-centered. So if we sort of look at ethics being the most good for the most people, then we are coming down on that responsibility to the group, that we each have that individual autonomy to make decisions, but the decisions on how to live an ethical life and to take a look at the consequences of our behavior, I think, is something that would distinguish us, that our ethics, and as you pointed out with the initial question, has much in common with other denominations and other branches of Judaism. A good person is going to be a good person, whether they are Jewish, Christian, Muslim. I mean, some of those things, we have so many variations in different cultures and religious traditions of the so-called golden rule, that clearly it is something that is meaningful for the human population of the world. But I think also the thing that would distinguish it is that we view ethics as human-centered, human-created. They're derivative of the human mind. They are not given from on high. And therefore, we're going to take a look and perhaps revise our ethical approach at different times. There was a majority approach that slavery was okay, and nobody challenged the ethics of that. So when you start to be able to say, well, I shouldn't say nobody. I see Adam's like, okay, but the point being is that the majority culture was accepting of it. And it took a lot of heavy lifting to say, no, that is not okay. That's unethical. And once you realize that it's human beings who are making that determination, then it's a very, very small step to say, they don't come from a supernatural being, so I think that's an important distinction as to what we have. And then again, humanistic Jews are going to focus on what we do. So we're not going to pray for the inspiration to figure out what we're supposed to do. And we have a piece in the book by our colleague Denise Handlarski on race and reconciliation. And what she was talking about basically is these are the values, the ethical values that we hold true. And therefore, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? We can't sit on the sidelines touting well, I thought about it and I realized this is a good thing. It's more of what we're going to do. It is that na'aseh shalom, that we are going to be the ones who do this.
So maybe we'll talk a little bit about identity and how we define being Jewish. What does it mean to be Jewish? For some people, it's a religious identity with a set of religious beliefs. For other people, it's an ethnic identity based on their inheritance and descent. For some, it's even a biological identity based on genes. You get people who get a genetic test and all of a sudden realize that they're 4.3% Jewish, and it really transforms their lives. And I'm not, mocking that. That it can be meaningful to them. But at the root of it, and Sherwin Wine writes a wonderful essay on what he calls kinship. It's identification with the Jewish people. You're part of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, the family of Israel, or not the state of Israel, obviously, but the people that claim that common connection and identity. Just like being part of the American people is a broad definition of a group that is based on connection. For some, it is a personal family heritage, and the idea of, my grandparents used this menorah, and now I get to use it. That's really meaningful for them. But it can also be an adoption process. It's a sort of a two-way street. We define it as adoption by the Jewish people to welcome someone new in, but also that person adopting Jewish peoplehood and connecting with the Jewish family in that way. Or another metaphor you might use is naturalization. When you join a new country and national community, you learn the language, you learn the culture, you learn maybe some of the recipes, you make connections with people. So that's really what becoming Jewish means for us, is being part of this Jewish family and identifying with it. And by the way, you can also resign from the Jewish family if you chose, I want to disown you. I want nothing to do with you. Okay, we'll let you out, but we also let people in. And that's really one of our core identity questions, that we're not going to put up high barriers for people joining the Jewish people. We certainly have opportunities for study. If people want to process, we can make that very meaningful. But in the end, it's their identification with the Jewish people that defines whether they're in or whether they're out. And that's meant, as a movement, we've been very inclusive for our entire existence, especially regarding families with one Jewish partner and one non-Jewish partner. Sherwin Wine, over his 50 or so year career, 45-year career as a humanistic rabbi, did over 4,000 weddings, because he was one of the only rabbis in the 60s and 70s and 80s who was willing to officiate or co-officiate at ceremonies where one partner was Jewish. Now, there was both a pragmatic and a moral side to that choice. The pragmatic side is, if you show up at the wedding, they have a greater chance of identifying as Jewish. If you tell them, forget it, I won't have one part of this terrible choice that you've made, what are the odds they're going to come back and maintain a positive connection? The moral side of it is that these individuals have the right to choose who they want to marry. That's what a free society means. We're not in the world of arranged marriages. So if they get to choose whom they fall in love with and the kind of family they want to build, we have an obligation to celebrate their culture and their heritage as it's going to be meaningful in their community. Again, that idea of complexity, of living in more than one world at a time, or having different feet in different cultures, that's also a part of our approach to intermarriage and intercultural families that broadens the concept of being Jewish and not just Jewish or something else. And our chapter on identity, or our section of the book on identity, is where we discuss Israel and Zionism, which has always been a contentious issue in Jewish life, but even more so in recent years, even months. Now, our movement has always had a meaningful relationship with secular Israel as a concept and secular Israelis in their lived life. We've drawn on Israeli music for many of our songs that we use at our services, the creativity of Israeli secular culture. If you want to be connected to Jewish history, the land of Israel is irreplaceable for Jewish roots, archaeology, and culture. And also, we've had meaningful personal experiences there. I led a learning trip to Israel some years ago. It was called Secular Israel because we wanted to see that side of things, not just the religious sites. But one of our stops was to an ancient synagogue that had been used in the 500s of the Common Era, and then it had been lost and destroyed after an earthquake. In the modern period, it's been archaeologically rediscovered, and we visited it shortly before they were setting up chairs for a bat mitzvah ceremony that would be taking place a little bit later that day. And I just found that experience, that moment, so wonderful. that we could see pictures of the zodiac on the floor to transform our understanding of historical Jewish ideology to think, really, they had the zodiac? Yes, they did. But also that you could have a bat mitzvah in this state park synagogue, again, in that same place where people had studied the Torah and had meaningful events centuries before. Now we're doing the same thing. So there's something irreplaceable in that sense of Jewish historical transcendence that we get from a connection with Israel. Now, as a movement, we share the value of human rights, we share the importance of Jewish survival, and we have a range of perspectives on the modern state of Israel and its choices and values and expressions, just as other liberal Jewish movements have a range of perspectives on the state. And so we decided, instead of having a hard statement of this is what humanistic Jews should think about Israel, we included an essay by another of our colleagues, Semach Yoreh, on how do we talk about Israel? How do we include diverse perspectives, understand people beyond our ordinary orbit of thoughts, and find ways to continue to talk about it, to stay in relationship with Israel, even if we have disagreements. After all, that's what sometimes family is about, is you stay in relationship despite disagreements. But the other piece of Israel, and this is the last thing I want to say on identity, is that humanistic Judaism has always been diaspora affirmative. That is, you can live a meaningful, positive, secular Jewish life not in Israel. In our early years of contact with Israelis, they would say, how can you do it if you're not doing it in Hebrew? How could you do it if you're not speaking Yiddish every day? How can you live a cultural and non-religious Jewish identity in English, in diaspora? And we've always said, yes, we can. And watch us, because here we are doing it. In our own creative way. There are challenges doing things in English. On the other hand, people actually understand what we're saying in a meaningful way without Hebrew language skills. And it enables us actually to celebrate the varieties of Jewish diaspora experience using Ladino and Ge'ez and other historic Jewish languages to inform, enrich, and expand our creative celebrations. So our identity is one that's rooted in diaspora as well as having connections to Israel. It's rooted in being Jewish and not just Jewish or, and it enables people to self-define their Jewishness, not just maintaining high barriers and keeping people out. That's part of our complexities, but we celebrate those and don't reject them.
I think one of the things that people forget about so-called Jewish languages is that largely what makes a language Jewish is that Jews are using that language. And therefore, there's a lot of Jews who are speaking English. English is, in its own way, a Jewish language when it's spoken by Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, the lovely part about that story, Adam, of the ancient synagogue with the bat mitzvah, right? It brings me back to what we were talking about earlier about humanistic Judaism or humanists who happen to be Jews, right? Because that moment, that sort of historically transcendent moment with an ancient synagogue and, as you point out, a bat mitzvah being held there, that wouldn't have meaning if you didn't have some form of a Jewish identity. It would be, okay, check the box, I've been there on my tour group, as opposed to I felt something because I was there, you know. The next section that we have in the book is on culture. And yes, Jewish culture is out there, and other, you know, we don't have a monopoly on Jewish culture. We don't have a monopoly on claiming Jewish culture because it does play a role in other denominations. But I think the significant difference is that humanistic Judaism centers Jewish culture as the basis for Jewish identity. And it's not out on the periphery. It's not secondary. Other denominations would have, I think, if they were to sort of diagram their systems, the religious aspect would be the center. That's where they use it as the foundation for their Jewish identity. And it's sort of the probably the basis of the question that we're always asked is, how can you be Jewish if you don't believe in God? Right? That is so central. And then out in the periphery, for those denominations, then you get Jewish culture. So, you know, of course, a synagogue's going to have a men's club or a women's club, and they're going to have bagels when they're going to be doing an event. You know, that's going to be the cultural Jewish aspect that they're bringing. Or they may have a klezmer music kind of concert, but at its core, other denominations center theology and religion and God. And at our core, we put Jewish culture. And Jewish culture is really it's broadly defined. So we have a very short piece, but such a meaningful piece by Yehuda Bauer on Judaism is. And it's Bible and it's Talmud, but that's not all, right? It's going to include all these other things. So we have essays in here on Jewish art and Jewish music. We have excerpts of Jewish literature. We have a piece about, what makes something Jewish literature. I mean, you have to get to some definitional things. Is it something that's written by someone who's Jewish, or does it have to have a Jewish topic? Same kind of thing with Jewish art. Is it going to be art produced by Jews or produced by anybody if it has a Jewish theme? And so, at some point, we have to have a form of boundary, or else, again, it's that pluralism swallowing up the Judaism. So all of these issues and themes that are in the book, they really weave through every single area of it. What ends up happening when you center Jewish culture is that you have kind of a wider canon and an ongoing canon of Jewish material because it was never fixed. It's not unchangeable. It's going to keep going. And we have a piece in the book by Amos Oz that talks about that the secular cart is full, that instead of a full cart that should yield, a full cart of religious material that should yield because the secular cart is empty and by implication meaningless, the idea is that the secular cart is very full. And if we take a look at all those different things, language and music and art and poetry and literature and on and on and on, we see that we have a very wide ongoing canon. And sometimes it may seem odd to talk about a canon, which sounds like a fixed body of material, but we wanted to make the point that in fact it does grow and it is ongoing, and it provides a really meaningful basis for a Jewish identity. If you want to join a book club and you're going to read about Jewish books and that's your connection to your congregation, that's fine. There are no judgments in that. If you want to, have kosher Chinese food, that's okay too. If you want your Chinese food not kosher, we're not judging on that one either. But the idea being that all of these different things, food, and food's a good example, different recipes, trying it out from Sephardic traditions and Ashkenazic traditions, Mizrahi traditions, Israeli traditions, all of these things, whether or not it's what you grew up with, is still part of the canon. And toward the end of the book, we have a section called Go Forth and Learn. And what we included in that section were things that were essentially not the written word. So, the bibliography might have some additional material if we've cited it, but these were songs and music and artwork and movies and television shows, all of these kinds of things. We included a couple of cookbooks instead of just straight out recipes, as a way of saying, now that you've been through the book, here are some other things, and don't consider yourself limited when you're figuring out how else to invoke Jewish culture as you explore your own Jewish identity.
The previous chapter was on identity, which you could call being Jewish. And the chapter on culture is what we would count as doing Jewish. And doing Jewish is not only religious practice, Torah study, and the conventional canon. It's also the reading, the music, the art that Jody was talking about. And it fits with the idea of multiple intelligences. You can learn, some people are verbal, and Jewish culture is historically very verbal, but maybe you're kinesthetic and you want to do Jewish dance, or maybe you're focused on, nature and you want to do a Jewish nature hike and look for plants that might be native to the Middle East. And there's all kinds of ways you can explore who you are and what you connect with through the Jewish canon in that broadly considered way. I sometimes like to say that our arc is wider. Our arc can include a Torah scroll, but can also include modern writers like Yehuda Amichai. We have a couple of his poems in here, and other writers like Nicole Krauss. We have a selection from one of her stories. So the idea that our canon is wider, our doing Jewish is wider, our sense of meaningful Jewish connection is a much broader understanding. And that, again, is something distinct from other movements.
One of the nice things I appreciate about this expansive understanding of the Jewish cultural canon is that it pushes both into the future, but also into the past. We can look retrospectively at things, music, musicals, film, toys, whatever it might be, that maybe weren't recognized as Jewish at the time. But as we look at them from, our standpoint today, we might see a Jewish subtext or a context there that would then include it within this cultural canon. So it's ever broadening in all different directions, which is really exciting.
Go ahead, Tracy.
It is an element sort of rediscovery too, so of course people may say, well, Jewish culture, of course it includes Yiddish writers, but Yiddish writers were always male. And so we made it a point of naming very specifically some Jewish women Yiddish writers. So as you're saying, we can look backwards and kind of unearth, if you will, things that have always been there, but nobody paid attention.
And that's why the last part of the book is focused on Jewish life, the lived experience, past and present. Not making a distinction between high culture and low culture, as might have been the case historically, and taking our values and our beliefs and applying it to how we celebrate being Jewish. It'd be like, I don't know, if you read the rules of basketball but never saw a basketball game, would you really understand basketball? Well, that's why we wanted to include examples of how we approach life cycle events, how we approach specific holidays, and how we make a consistent humanistic experience out of our celebrations. We have a whole section actually on our approach to liturgy, which is one of the clear distinctions from us and other movements, as I mentioned earlier. Some other movements have made minimal edits, they tweak the liturgy, or they have a creative translation, and we decided let's not be afraid of changing the Hebrew too, and let's make it say what we believe. And there'll be times we can use traditional pieces. We sing Hine Ma Tov or Hevenu Shalom Aleichem as other Jewish communities would. There are times we draw on modern creative writing of our own movement or by people who are just poets in the general world. We include a passage by the modern liturgist Marcia Falk, where she talks about the kind of choices she makes in creating liturgy, and we felt that really reflects what we do. In fact, my congregation uses that as liturgy in our services because we found her message so meaningful. And then, of course, we do have some adapted liturgy, as we mentioned, the example of Oseh Shalom to Naaseh Shalom and other changes like that. We even included a passage from a humanistic Haggadah by Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, of blessed memory, since he passed away this past year. But in his liberated Haggadah, he includes an approach to explaining the reasons for the symbols in the Seder. And he gives many reasons for the symbols, not just one reason, one that jives with tradition, one that jives with modern archaeology and scientific understanding of the evolution of the symbol, and one that's sort of a creative, homiletic, almost midrashic kind of response to why we celebrate or why we eat a particular food or use a particular symbol in the Seder. So I found that really wonderful to show people this is how we do it. People will say, well, if you don't have the conventional prayers, then what is Passover like, or what is the service like? And it's not just a CIA redacted document with a lot of blackouts from all the God stuff. It really is a creative re-understanding and reinterpretation and rewriting of that tradition in our image, as every generation has rewritten Jewish liturgy and practice in their image. We included examples of our approach to life cycle events and our focus on both human needs and personal meaning, but also celebrating our cultural inheritance through both choice and creativity, but also some value of continuity and finding our own balance there. And the book concludes with a section on Jewish education, because Jewish life is nothing without a future, and that future comes from education, both for youth and for adults. Our goal in education is cultural literacy beyond just what we do, but it's also studying our sources, particularly the Torah and the earliest sources of Jewish life, as human-authored creativity. It's a text written in a particular time and place, and so we can look at it as literature. We can look at it as reflecting those values, which we may or may not agree with. It's historical evidence for when it was written, if not always for what it's describing. It's the first stories of our people, and we learn the stories of other peoples without having to believe that they actually happened. We can do the same for ours, but that gives us a sense of roots. It lets us get the jokes in later literature that refers back to the earlier literature, which we wouldn't know if we didn't study the first sources. And it allows us to make our voice part of the dialogue. I love the visual of the Talmud page, where you have an early source, sometimes commenting on the Bible as an even earlier source, and then you've got a few generations later comments on those ideas, and then along one side you've got the comments of Rashi, and on the other side you've got the comments of Rashi's grandsons who didn't agree with Rashi all the time, and you get these layers of dialogue. It's almost like a web page. It's a wonderful book called The Talmud and the Internet from 25 years ago that was insightful in this area, but it still speaks to us that we're part of this dialogue. We're part of the conversation. We have to know what they're talking about, but we also have the right to our own voice. And that's what makes it so meaningful to us. There's a wonderful metaphor that's in one of Amos Oz's essays that I believe is in the book, where he describes us not as museum curators who have to keep things exactly the same, but as heirs. We've inherited all of this rich creativity, but it's still our house. And we get to choose what we display on our walls in our lived experience. We can adapt it sometimes in new ways. We can create our own to then pass on to our children, and they'll make their choices, which may disagree with us again. That's the joy of a living tradition and treating Jewishness as our inheritance, our legacies from the past, but not as a binding covenant that we must follow or a museum that we must preserve exactly the same way as it always was. So we felt that ending the book with examples of Jewish life that show people how we actually do humanistic Judaism in a congregational setting would be really important for people to understand who we are, what we do.
As with any Jewish movement, there are sometimes discrepancies between official statements from the movement and its leaders and how individuals or communities conduct themselves on the ground. One example highlighted in the book concerns the movement's earlier rejection of kippot, or skull caps as they're sometimes called, and some humanistic Jews who wear kippot for their own personal reasons. Do you think this sort of autonomy is a strength of humanistic Judaism?
Well, we had touched on the that balance of individual empowerment and group consensus or shared practice, and the challenges involved in that. Sometimes we're, as Jody said, we're herding cats, or I might say Katzes and Schwartzes and everybody else. I think of the scene in the movie The Life of Brian, which is about a messianic figure where thousands of people are following him, and he says, "You don't need to follow me. You can think for yourselves." And 10,000 people say in unison, "Yes, we can all think for ourselves. Yes, we're all individuals." Well, if they're all individuals, why are they saying what we tell them to say? So we have to find that balance. I remember an early humanist Haggadah by Sherwin Wine from the 1970s described the sharing of the egg as part of the Seder. And there were instructions in the Seder, in the Haggadah that he wrote, that said, at this point, you have a blessing for the egg, and then it says, all should take the egg and salt it to improve its flavor. And I thought to myself, well, what if I don't want salt on my egg? Do I have any right of personal taste to choose not to do that? If I'm being a humanist and the Haggadah says to do it, then maybe I have to. So maybe there's more of that individual empowerment, enabling people to make their own choices. But we also want to challenge people to consider their practices and choices from Jewish tradition through a humanistic lens. Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean you have to keep doing it that way. Maybe there are new symbols that are more meaningful to you, or maybe the old symbol just doesn't speak to you anymore. If it does speak to you, why does it speak to you? And how might you approach it differently? So you shouldn't have to say words you don't believe to light Hanukkah candles. We've written humanistic blessings for Hanukkah candles, Shabbat candles, wine, all those core symbols in Jewish life. Because for us, personal meaning is our standard for Jewish practice, and the old words didn't speak to us, we'll write new words. That doesn't mean that members of our communities might not do both humanistic and traditional blessings if it's meaningful to them. And we don't have an Inquisition police that's going around checking who's glot humanist, who's strictly humanist all the way through, and who is, flexidox and doing a little bit of it. That's up to them. What we do as a community is what we share, and that's the humanistic practice and belief. But we empower people to make their own choices. Otherwise, we wouldn't be humanists. Part of our humanism is empowering people to make those choices.
And when you lead a community that may have people doing different things like traditional blessings at different times and so on, you again, it's part of that life of courage, if I can be so immodest about that, that institutionally we represent something. We can't just let everybody start, during a reading, start doing the version that they want. That's not going to be okay. We can't say, well, and because it was this way, Now here, get a chance. If we are heirs, as Adam alluded to the Amos Oz piece, it means that we also have heirlooms, right? We have these heirlooms that have come down to us. Can we reinterpret them? Oftentimes, yes. If there is not a reinterpretation that is consistent with our values and our philosophy and our and integrity, then that ritual item might not get used. So if I do a bar bat mitzvah and the family wants to use a talit, they're not doing it because they want to, cover themselves and humble themselves before God. It is either belong to a grandparent, generally a grandfather, or a grandparent went on a trip for Israel when the baby was born and they saved it for this very day. And so what I say is that the fringes of the talit tie the generations together. And people are just like, that's a totally different way of looking at it. Now, I don't wear any so-called clerical garb. I don't put on a talit, that belonged to my grandfather or anything like that when I'm leading a service. That's going to be misinterpreted, because unless you say out loud what you're doing, then their imagination's going to run wild and they're going to default to what they previously learned instead of how they want to go forward with what they're, with their connection. And same thing, I was going to say, when Adam was talking about examples of liturgy and so on, we include ketubah text is you can get it through any ketubah artist or whatever. The Association of Humanistic Rabbis adopted a text, and we don't have to say, well, you're a humanistic Jew and therefore you don't have a ketubah. If you want a ketubah, here's a different way to do it. Here are a statement of mutual promises. That's, nobody's buying the bride, So all of these things can be changed, and changed with integrity, not in a way that's going to make it unrecognizable in the Jewish community.
You can also find alternatives that meet the same need. So if, let's say, a family doesn't have a tallis that's important to them, or the kid has never seen the parents ever wear a tallis in his lifetime or her lifetime or their lifetime, and it's not part of their family ritual, they just want the kid dressed up, for the event. Well, maybe there are alternatives that they can consider. Maybe they light Shabbat candles regularly, and having the student get their own Shabbat candles would be a meaningful Jewish heirloom gift for that moment. Part of our job as humanistic rabbis is to empower people to make these choices and to feel confident that their choices, even if not traditional, are still important, meaningful, valid, and Jewish. That counts too. New counts too. So that's part of our job as humanistic rabbis, is empower people to do that. And hopefully, this book will give people that permission to make their own Judaism and make their Judaism their own.
So you've alluded to this many times as we're talking, what is important about the book, what you hope readers will take away. But I'm just curious if you could put it into one or two sentences. What is the goal of this book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism?
So in the preface, we say that the volume is an invitation. And I guess really, if we want to carry that metaphor through, we want people to RSVP to the invitation. And so for people who are already part of the movement, we want to be able to give them a deeper understanding of things that they're doing, a deeper knowledge base that perhaps they didn't have. They understand at a certain level why they're a humanistic Jew, but we want to be able to empower them to say with greater confidence, perhaps, greater knowledge, what it means to be a humanistic Jew. Then for people who are secular Jews but aren't part of humanistic Judaism, we want them to know that there's a place for them, that they don't have to just give up and make compromises that they aren't comfortable doing, that they join the path of least resistance and join the synagogue that they grew up in, that their parents grew up in, whatever it is, and that they can find community, that they will understand that their multicultural, multi-ethnic families, interfaith families, if you will, are welcomed, that they too can find integrity so that their words match their beliefs. And they can find deep meaning in that. They don't have to sort of or come to think that they are the only ones on this path. That community will be able to provide that. They also will be able to discover that creativity gives us the ability, human creativity, to reshape and reinterpret rituals and texts and things like that, as we've been talking about. And for other denominations, that would sort of be like the third audience, is to understand that we exist, that we're well thought out, we've been around for a while, that we too are heirs to the tradition. I was speaking with some reform educators, and they were talking about the so-called surge that they're seeing of people who have not been associated with Jewish life, but now suddenly want to be associated with Jewish life. And sometimes that means that families who don't know about humanistic Judaism are joining their congregations. And I said, if I have a family that we're not a good fit, I would suggest that they go to a different congregation if they're really, not going to feel comfortable with our philosophy and our liturgy and so on. I said to them, and I would hope you would do the same thing, that if you have a family that that the people are agnostic or atheist or free thinkers, or that their children are, that you would say, you know what, we're not a good fit for you. We're over here. There's another one. And in our area there are two. So maybe that's a better fit for you. And I think if people read the book and they understand all of these very deliberate choices that we made, both in terms of what we included in it, how we organized it, and how we titled all the different sections, I think that they would be well served as well.
I wanted to share the cover of the book, which really is a wonderful graphic design from someone in Jody's family. But you can see here all the different concepts that we've tried to put together in this volume. And this is just the start. That go forth and learn idea goes back to a story where someone wants to convert to Judaism, wants all of Judaism while standing on one foot. And Rabbi Hillel says, do not do to others what's hurtful to you. The rest is commentary. And then he says, now come and learn. Now, or go forth and learn, depending on the translation. But that's our point, is that this is just the starting point. Humanistic Judaism is a deep and rich identity. It's not thin. It's not Judaism light. It's not the lowest on the totem pole of the descending order of seriousness when you list Jewish denominations. By the way, try listing them alphabetically. It will really throw people off. If you list conservative, humanistic, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Reform, they'll be like, what? Because they're used to it going down, and that's not how it is. They're equally valid approaches. Ours is equally valid to those other denominations and approaches to Jewish identity. It's a deep Jewish identity. It's rooted in culture. It's inspired by the sweep of tradition and history, and also the potential of the human mind and uplifting the human spirit. It's meaningful to us. It's meaningful to our families and our communities. We hope it's meaningful to others. They need to know that we exist, as Jody said, to have that door opened. But I hope that this volume shows to them, and even to the broader Jewish world, that we are an important part of the Jewish family, part of the Jewish conversation, the spectrum of Jewish identities, and it can be a meaningful Jewish connection, equally valid to others. Is there a correct flavor of bagel? Well, you might think so. But in general, we don't say that there's only one kind of bagel that counts. So if there's many Judaisms for many Jews, this is an important part of the course.
I got to say that when people complain about certain flavors of bagel and they say, this isn't even a bagel, how can it have chocolate chips or whatever? I just think, come on. Of course it's a bagel.
Right.
Thank you both so much for joining me and for putting this book together. I think already I really appreciate the work that you've done with contemporary humanistic Judaism. And anyone who gets their hands on this book will be delighted, informed, inspired, curious, all those things that I think you're hoping for.
Great. And we'll make sure to put a link for how to order the book in the description of the video. It's available both in print and ebook. So hopefully you'll take a look for yourself.